As you will hopefully recall, the last lecture was about sleep and stress, and I began it confessionally saying it's like my least favorite topic in the whole field of stress because I can't talk about it and think about it without getting all agitated because I'm lousy at getting enough sleep. However, truth be told, this is my least favorite lecture because I appear to also be lousy at getting older. All right, what's the picture of aging? Picture of aging, it's wonderful when it works right. You become wise, you become peaceful, you become self-actualized. You wind up looking like Jessica Tandy or someone. It's all great. And as far as I can tell, I am not hurtling in that direction at all. I do not anticipate being wise or calm or any of that. Instead, I suspect I'm going to be paying the price of way too much agitated stress throughout the years. And what this lecture is about is trying to look at the actual science underlying that distressing outcome. What does stress have to do with aging? Lots. And to begin to appreciate that, where we have to start off with is, what's aging about? What is the biological process? How could you define aging? And we all know how to define aging in a very technical sort of way. Aging is the time of life where your body goes to hell on you. Okay, we could probably define that a little bit more precisely. Aging is the time of life where you become more fragile. Aging is the time of life where if you take a 20-year-old and an 80-year-old and they both slip on the ice, the 80-year-old is more likely to get the broken pelvis. Aging is the time of life where, as just described, you become more fragile. For the same insult, you are more likely to get injury. For the same degree of challenge, you are more likely to get injured. Fragility, lack of resiliency. So given that, and that's a pretty good technical definition of what aging is about, increased fragility over time, got to give you a first absolutely stunning fact about this whole field, which is, by that definition, an awful lot of species on this planet don't age. Absolutely remarkable. They don't age, they don't show this property of becoming more fragile over time. That's amazing. Now, mind you, these are not some of the most exciting species on Earth. These are amoeba and fungi and liverworts and who knows what. This is not to say that they live forever. If you get hit by a meteor and you're an amoeba, and it doesn't matter really what age you are because it's going to do you in, but nonetheless, you don't see that pattern of increased fragility during time. And a 500-year-old redwood tree is just as likely or just as unlikely to be done in by some beetle infestation as a 50-year-old redwood. A large percentage of the species on this planet do not age by this rule of increased fragility over time. Second amazing feature of this field, when you think about that as the definition of aging, the species that do age are some of the most recently evolved ones. They're some of the fanciest ones out there. They're vertebrates, they're mammals, they're primates, and you suddenly have this boggling realization: aging is a recent invention. Aging is in the evolutionary avant-garde. The genes that are central to this process of becoming more fragile over time, by the standpoint of the glacial pace of evolution, evolved relatively recently in some of the most complex species on this planet. What is this about? This is totally bizarre. And what you begin to see, though, is a hint about what aging, what this increased fragility, might be good for. You look at a pattern of what aging is like, what population dynamics are like, in those species that, in fact, don't age. And you can sort of chart this in a way where you start off with, obviously, 100% of the population, and somewhere out the other end, you're going to have 0% of the population still alive, but the rate at which they disappear is an absolute straight line. For those of you who care about such mathematical minutia, it's on a logarithmic scale. Nonetheless, over the course of time, the number of individuals in that population declines at the same exact rate. There's no aging. No matter how long an organism has been around, it does not become intrinsically more fragile. So now you look at those recently evolved species that show aging, that show this property of increased fragility. And you can see that in a way that is in fact definitional, as you start with 100% of the population, and as time goes by, at some point it stops being a straight line. At some point, the population declines faster than that straight line would predict. What's that? That's the aging process. That's beginning to fall apart after a certain time of life. That's beginning to be more fragile. So again, this notion, this stuff might have evolved relatively recently. Evolution does not bring about sort of processes that make you fall apart as you get older. There's got to be something adaptive about it. And you look at those population dynamics, and then you see something interesting. Because the species that show aging, in other words, at some point, instead of population number declining in a smooth line, it suddenly crashes a lot faster. You notice something else, which is earlier in life, the survival rate is better than that straight line would have predicted. And this is really interesting. And what this is, if you want to term it, this is the there's no free lunch hypothesis about aging, which is as follows. What aging is about is not the genetics, the evolutionary adaptiveness of falling apart as you get older. It's about all sorts of advantages earlier in life that increase evolutionary success, increase the number of copies of genes you pass on, and there's no free lunch. Eventually the bill comes, which is now falling apart faster than anticipated. And when framed this way, this is great. When framed this way, this is not the evolution of falling apart. This is the evolution of all sorts of genetic advantages earlier in life, and eventually you pay the bill. And there's even a fancy technical term for this, and do not even dream of memorizing this. This is called negative pleiotropy. The notion of some genetic trait that gives you advantages earlier in life at the cost of disadvantages later on. And that's what aging really is. Okay, this is very abstract. Let me give you one example. In primates, you see this pattern in male primates, in fact, which is you've got prostate glands, and prostate glands do something or other to your sperm, and I don't know what they do. I once knew it for a final exam for about 3 hours, but your prostate makes your sperm happier and faster and jump higher, and primates tend to have prostate glands with very high metabolic rates. In other words, that are really good at making your sperm all perky. So that's the early stage in the curve. That's where the fertility rate, that's where the passing on number of copies of your genes is doing better than expected. And what's the bill that eventually comes? You can't spend your whole life with your prostate having this blasting high metabolic rate without the danger being that metabolism will spiral out of control into uncontrolled growth, into cancer. And thus we have an explanation for why male primates, and particularly human ones, are so vulnerable towards prostatic cancer as they get older. So there's no free lunch theme. Most organisms do not show this classical pattern of aging. Those that do, they're more in the evolutionary avant-garde, and those that do, it's not really selection for falling apart, it's selection for a trait that's advantageous earlier in life, and along comes the bill. So now we have some sense of what the aging process is about. So where does stress intersect with it? And from virtually day one in the 1930s, with Selye popularizing the term, with the whole field taking off as a subfield of medicine, from day one people were already thinking, okay, stress and aging, they've got to be intertwined in some sort of very basic way. And this theorizing took two forms, and we're going to spend this talk exploring these two. The first one, aging is a time of life when organisms don't deal with stress very well. Second notion, lots of stress throughout the lifetime will accelerate the aging process. And as you can immediately see, we've got yet another vicious circle on our hands. Stress, lots of stress, makes you get older faster. Older, more fragile, can be translated in our language into less of an ability to deal with stress. So what's the evidence for these two ideas? Focusing on the first one, the notion of aging being a time of life where you don't deal very well with stress. There is endless evidence for this at all sorts of different levels of body function. At the cellular level, we know a little bit about DNA from the earlier lectures, and DNA, in fact, every time cells divide, you make a copy of the DNA, and that's great, and with a shockingly high rate, there's mistakes. There's little hiccups of mistakes in copying your DNA into the new cell, little mutations that slip in, not infrequently, lots of the time. And fortunately, we come with some spanking efficient, overactive, ADD-ish sort of enzymes in there that repair your DNA. And typically, they keep up just fine, lots of little random mistakes in your DNA, which quickly get fixed up. So, of course, we've got here a grim finding, and one that fits in with this picture of aging being a time of life where you don't deal with stress very well. In this case, the stress of having DNA damage, your capacity of doing DNA repair goes down as you get older. Another example, now rather than at the cellular level, at the level of sort of whole organism physiology, take someone and experimentally drop their core body temperature a couple of degrees and then see how long does it take the body to get it together and overcome this hypothermic stressor. How long does it take for core body temperature to get back to where it was? And what you see is the older the individual, the longer it takes. Resting body temperature does not change with age for the most part. The baseline function does not change. What changes is the capacity to recover from a temperature stressor. Aging is a time of life where you don't deal with stress very well. Final example, very much on the whole organism level, what happens to IQ with aging? Notice I am not saying what happens to intelligence with aging and the extent to which IQ tests test intelligence. I'm not going within a mile of that one, but in the much more narrow sense, what does the aging process do to IQ performance? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on all sorts of factors, including how much time pressure there is to the test. And you give somebody some cognitive sort of test, an IQ test perhaps, or other versions thereof of cognitive function, and what you see is the less time pressure there is, the longer somebody can spend on it, the less of an age-related decline there is in performance, often no decline whatsoever. Now throw in a stressor, not the stressor of DNA mistakes or the stressor of hypothermia. Now throw in the stressor of time pressure. Less and less time to carry out this task, and the more time pressure there is, the more there's an age-related decline in performance. So what we see here is lots of evidence, cellular level, organ level, whole organism level, for this notion that aging is a time of life where you don't deal with stress very well anymore. So naturally what we want to do is translate this into one of our greatest markers of stress. What happens to glucocorticoid levels as we get older? What happens to patterns of activation of the sympathetic nervous system? And the general pattern that you see in a bunch of species, lots of rodents for example, is as you get older, your resting basal levels of glucocorticoids begin to climb. In other words, as you get older, in the absence of stress, your body is acting as if there's a mild stressor. What about humans? The picture is a little bit more complicated in that you look in an older literature and you look at what happens to resting glucocorticoid levels as you become geriatric, and the answer that was in the literature was there's no change, levels stay just fine. And you look at those older studies and you find something that I thought was kind of humorous way back when I was a grad student, and horrifying now, which is back in the old days, they would do studies where geriatric populations were defined as, say, age 50 or higher. My God, what things were like back when. So now when you have studies in gerontological ones, aging is thought to really count as blasting along, extreme aging, age 80 or so. And when you look at that literature, glucocorticoid levels stay reasonably flat until extreme old age, and then they take off. They tend to rise. Similar pattern as well with the sympathetic nervous system. So you've got one marker of your body not dealing very well with stress in old age, elevated basal levels of glucocorticoids. Now, a second problem comes in, and this is one that is screamingly familiar by now conceptually from some of these earlier lectures, which is the stress response, the amount of glucocorticoids you could pump out in response to a stressor. That doesn't change a whole lot during aging. What does change, and this will make perfect sense, is the recovery time, how long it takes to get back to baseline. So the sort of changes you see during aging in this whole stress hormone world, predominantly the glucocorticoid one, is a tendency, a very delayed tendency in humans towards resting levels of glucocorticoids rising and a longer recovery time after a stressor is over with, and we know by now all the bad things that happen. So what's the price of these elevated glucocorticoid levels that you see in old age? There's no problem, no challenge here in coming up with all sorts of versions of it. One very sort of striking one, extremely interesting one, was work done some years ago by Heather Cameron at the National Institutes of Health. And looking at that revolution we heard about earlier on, that business that no, it's not the case that the adult brain doesn't make any more neurons, there is adult neurogenesis. In the hippocampus, as we heard, maybe it's essential for certain types of learning. And what she has observed is the rate of neurogenesis in the hippocampus goes down during aging. And in a very clever, insightful study, what she did was, well, we've got these aged rats with their elevated glucocorticoid levels. What if we turn their glucocorticoid levels into the sort you would see in young rats? And you do that, and the rate of neurogenesis pops up again. What's happening is those elevated glucocorticoid levels with age are one of the factors inhibiting senescent neurogenesis. And that's pretty interesting. So we've seen now the first half of this sort of story that's been set up, the notion that aging is a time of life where you don't deal very well with stress, cellular evidence, organ evidence, organismal, endocrine evidence, what the glucocorticoid profile looks like, and what we've seen is you pay a price, less DNA repair, less ability to regulate temperature, less cognitive ability that's rapidly available to you, and all the prices that are paid by having the excess of glucocorticoids. So now let's switch to the second half of these sort of twin theories. The notion that not only is aging a time of life where you don't deal very well with stress, but lots of stress over the lifetime can accelerate the aging process. And it turns out there's plenty of support for this idea as well. Let's start off with an extremely dramatic version of it, which is mostly just flashy, but ultimately quite informative. Now, any of us who endlessly watch all those National Geographic specials, there's all these realms of animals doing amazing, phenomenal, heroic tasks. And this is the world of like male penguins standing on top of the egg all winter long while mom is out shopping. And this is the world of like desiccated camels going weeks and months without water. All of which fall under this sort of umbrella of, wow, animals do some amazing things. And out in that world of heroic National Geographic worthy animal sort of exploits, one of the most amazing ones is salmon. Salmon, when they come back to spawn, and that whole world of swimming upstream and leaping over dams and all of that, and it's extremely impressive. Here's another thing that's extremely interesting about salmon, which is they go and spawn, they get back to where they were born, the pond, whatever, and they get back there, they spawn, they lay their eggs, and a week or two later, all the salmon are dead. What is that about? This is termed a programmed die-off. The process of spawning, mating, sets this rapidly emerging clock into action, which kills you a couple of weeks later. What is this about? And it turns out there might be some evolutionary logic to this. There's all sorts of theories. For example, the notion that after dying, what the purpose of this is the salmon's body disintegrates and leaves all sorts of great nutrients from the body on the floor of the water there, and the new guppies and new puppies and whatever you call baby salmon, they now have stuff to feed on. This is a model that reminds me actually of a talk I once heard by a very accomplished neuroscientist who was giving a talk to a bunch of young scientists and sort of telling them not about the technicalities of the science, but instead telling them about how you do a career in science, that sort of advice. And at one point, one of these starting off in the field young scientists said to the guy, well, what could somebody in a senior position like you do in order to help out this younger generation? And his answer was, die and get out of the way. One of the leading theories as to what this program die-off is about is salmon get out of the way for the next generation, and in fact, their body parts feed the next generation, all sorts of evolutionary theories. But now you ask, why does this program die-off occur, not at the level of evolutionary explanations, but instead at the nuts and bolts level of what's going on in the body? What is it that happens right after salmon spawn that send them hurtling into this inevitable program death soon afterward? And a number of decades ago, people got the answer to it, and this is so interesting and instantly makes a lot of sense: glucocorticoids. The second those salmon spawn, they've got an explosion of glucocorticoid secretion like nothing you see elsewhere in the animal kingdom, and it just goes blasting through the roof. And you better bet at this point that you can make a long list of what goes wrong in these guys. They get immunosuppressed, they have hypertension, they get parasites, they get ulcers, they probably get depressed and get cognitively impaired and all that sort of stuff. It is driven by this burst of glucocorticoid secretion in the aftermath of spawning. How do you know? And now you do a really striking study. You take these salmon, and right after they've spawned, you go in there and you adrenalectomize them. You take out their adrenal glands. You take out the source of their glucocorticoids, and instead of dying 2 weeks later, they live another year. Here we have this programmed process of accelerated aging. What's weirdest of all is it's not just salmon who have evolved this. There's all these Australian marsupial mice where after they give birth, they're all dead 2 weeks later, and then there's some sort of eels that migrate back to the Sargasso Sea, and I actually haven't a clue where the Sargasso Sea is and why eels do this, but they've got the same deal as well, which is programmed death, and remarkably, it's the same mechanism. Again, it's this burst of glucocorticoids right after that period, which gets you old really fast. And what we see is here, at least 3 times evolutionarily, in totally different branches of the animal world, eels and fish and marsupial mice, if for whatever strange evolutionary reason there is that you want to get old really fast, the way to do it is with lots and lots of glucocorticoids. Really a remarkable finding. Despite that being remarkable and all the insight and fascination of this, we're not salmon. Most of us are not Sargassian eels or marsupial mice, and our process of aging is nothing dramatic like that. What's it doing in terms of response to stress? And what is seen by now is a very substantial literature supporting that notion. Naturally, back when, it started off not as data, not as actual findings, but instead lots of theorizing, and Selye was the very first to start this with all sorts of wear and tear models, which made perfect sense, lots of stress, and that will accelerate the aging process, and that was wonderful and heartwarming. Wear and tear as the core of aging. The trouble, of course, was nobody knew biologically what wearing and tearing is about. These were very undefined terms. In the aftermath, some other scientists put a lot more sort of structure to these notions of wear and tear, the notion of using up certain amounts of adaptive energy, resiliency, and this was only slightly less than mythology and folktale in terms of being able to translate it into actual science. But very soon you just got all sorts of versions of the faster you are exposed to all sorts of stressors, the more severely so, the faster you're going to get the little bits of cardiovascular problems and metabolic problems and all the stuff we know oh so well by now. So lots of theoretical reasons why that should be the case. What's the actual evidence for the notion that lots of stress will accelerate the aging process? And by now, there's tremendous amounts of evidence. Some of it we heard about earlier, the work of Sonia Lupien in University of Montreal, that business about looking at these populations of aged humans where she's able to do the gold standard of these sorts of studies, a longitudinal prospective study. It's the same folks that she studies year after year, and what she sees is a history of lots of stressors, and the cognitive decline of aging is accelerated. So that's not good. Another version of this, a closely intertwined one, and another scientist that we've discussed earlier, Michael Meany of McGill University, you'll recall that he did that research where you pick up the baby rats and you neonatally handle them and you put them back with mom, and mom is more attentive as long as it's a very short period. And what he discovered was that these animals have a much more successful old age. That what you see is get the right amount of neonatal stimulation, and in their old age, they won't have lost as many hippocampal neurons. Their cognition is better, their health is better, and all sorts of things work better. And what's the mechanism for this? And this was actually some work I did in collaboration with Meany. What is one of the most interesting consequences of that neonatal handling mentioned earlier on? As an adult, you've got lower basal glucocorticoid levels. And what you see is, over the course of a lifetime, lower those levels, lower the cumulative exposure to glucocorticoids, and you get older slower. Another version of support for this notion, stress can accelerate the aging process. More evidence. And now we've seen that stress can increase the likelihood of metabolic wear and tear. We've already heard this one, a very specialized type of stress. Remember back earlier, those Dutch hunger winter fetuses. This was stress very early in life, prenatal starvation, and what that set these individuals up for is a body which, thanks to its changed thrifty metabolism, hurdles you at a highly significantly higher rate towards some of the diseases that are more common with aging. As we saw, metabolic syndrome, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, yet another realm. And what experiments have shown since then is it's not just the prenatal stress and stress throughout the lifetime, and you are accelerating, you are increasing the likelihood of these metabolic diseases of aging. And that makes perfect sense. Deprivation at any point in life, and you are going to set yourself up with all sorts of stressors, the increased appetite afterward. We heard that before, the role of glucocorticoids in the recovery phase of appetite. And what that's going to do is give you a bigger girth and make you more of an apple, the abdominal fat, and make you more likely to get those metabolic diseases of aging. Final example, and this is a study that's gotten an enormous amount of attention in the recent years since it came out, and this was work done by Alyssa Eppel at UCSF, and this was the same scientist who did some of the work referred to earlier about stress profiles in people who have lots of abdominal fat. This was an area of research she moved into subsequently, and this is one that has just taken the field by storm. You got your DNA, and long stretches of DNA form chromosomes, and turns out they're fragile in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways they are is this is like a long string of genetic information. It's like a shoelace. It's wrapped around, all sorts of stuff, but it has this potential problem of fraying at the ends. And this is always the metaphor everybody uses, so I'm obliged as well. What you thus have to have at the ends of your chromosomes are the same thing as you get on your shoelaces, those little plastic layered wrappy things which stabilize the end of your shoelace DNA, keep them from fraying. And it turns out that these exist, and these are called telomeres. Telomeres is the stabilizing end of DNA, and in fact, the discovery of them resulted in the 2009 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. Incredibly interesting stuff. So telomeres, this is not a part of DNA that codes for a gene. This is just a little plastic wrapping at the end of the long shoelace of DNA. And what you see is, over the course of time, the telomere shortens. It gets a little bit more frayed. It shortens, and when it eventually gets to the point where it's short enough, frayed enough, that there's no longer really a functional telomere there anymore, the DNA gets all ratty and ragged and all of that, and the cell has hurtled into some degree of